going to go through Genesis. And so part of what we'll do is, we'll, especially the first chapter, but on most of the chapters, we'll go through and look at the first chapter, couple of chapters especially. We'll look into a lot of detail. And then at the end of it, we'll always come back and look, because you never want to look, when you read the Bible, you never want to lose the forest for the trees. It's good to dig in and look at stuff and try to learn as much as you can, but ultimately, the purpose of the Bible is to use it so that we can apply it to our lives. And so we want to make sure we understand why it was written. And that's always the goal, even as we look at it tonight, is we want to look at what the text says. And anytime we try to read a passage of the Bible, interpret a passage of the Bible, the goal is to take it from the original to the author. We should never interpret a passage different than what it was meant for the original audience. And then we have to consider the difference between the original audience and us and the current audience. And we have like the river in between of what is there that's different. Because our society is different. The way we look at phrases is different. The way we react to things is different. It's like I talk a lot in the book of John, where Jesus calls his mom woman at the cross. Now, you would never do that in this century. But why did that, but it was actually, could be seen as endearment then. And so it's fine, but you've got to cross those cultural bridges to make sure we understand, so that we always find the principle that matters the most. And so we're going to dig into a lot of mess over tonight and probably the next week or two. And but ultimately we're going to come back at the end and look at an outline of the passage of 1:1 through 2:3 and look at the main message that we want to see. And again, it's because a lot of people have a lot of questions about creation. I will tell you that just, and I've shared with y'all some of the weird things I thought as a kid, are just different things that I wrestled with as a kid, in trying to make them make sense for me, to understand the Bible, understand God, and different things that just, for whatever reason, to me didn't seem, anyway, that I just wrestled with. And one has always been creation. Not that God is creative, that's never been a question. But the idea of, is it an old earth, is it a new earth? How do you take the scientific, they tell you that a river in Colorado has been there for the last 3 million years. Well, if you believe the Bible, it can't be there for 3 million years. Or could it have happened over 3 million years? And anyway, so that's kind of, so that's kind of stuff I always wonder about. And Dr. Selhammer, who's now passed, he wrote a book called Genesis Unbound. When we get to historical creationism, if you want to really dig into that, the book to do is the book is called Genesis Unbound. I saw a criticism of it once that said that Dr. Selhammer is so literal to the text that it can be misleading. And I forgot what it said after that, but that's the part of the sentence I remember. But it just always made me laugh that you're fussing at the guy for being too literal to the text, and how he comes up with this. And he uses, there's a lot, and I'm not giving y'all 10% of the stuff that backs up what some of the stuff we'll talk about when we get to historical creationism. I'm just trying to give you an overview of it. But if you really want to read the details, because I read it again this week and got excited again. It just fascinates me that just some different stuff that it comes together as you start to read it. And so we'll focus a lot on creation. And then we always want to keep in mind, this book was written by Moses to the Israelites so that they would remember him. Joshua, remember the book of the law that Moses wrote. Do not depart from it. Teach the law to your your children. And so we always want to remember, again, their town, this was originally written to Israelites. And so we want to make sure that we address some of those cultural differences, because it does play, some of this plays on how we potentially read Genesis 1. The biggest part about creation, and the reason the Bible starts with, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The Bible starts there because even secular people will acknowledge that if there is a creator, then we have to answer to the creator. I mean, that's why people fight so hard. You've got the intelligent design theories now that actually started from secular scientists, because they got to where they couldn't believe evolution anymore. They just scientifically they couldn't believe it, and said, well, no, there has to be a design. And And there's a lot to be said on that. You know, the original, even though Darwin's original theory says if you find something smaller than a cell, I mean, in his premise of how he sets up his theory, part of the premise of his theory is there can't be something smaller than a cell. Well, we know now that there are things much smaller than a cell. And when the idea of evolution comes about, this idea that you can evolve, well, you cannot evolve DNA-wise from species to species. So there's no chance that we were once fish that became apes that became man because the DNA doesn't work. I mean, you could do 10 trillion years. It wouldn't matter because the DNA doesn't work. And so there's a lot of things in science now that are obvious to people that have an objective mind that tell you there has to be an intelligent design, which makes it easier for us for Christians because then we get to argue who is the intelligent designer. So if you can get past that hurdle, so this is the first big hurdle in apologetics. But people cling to the idea of evolution because they don't want to acknowledge that but intuitively God made us to know that we are answerable to the Creator, right? Because I know that from what verse? Not in Genesis. Romans 1. That God has revealed himself so that we know his divine attributes. And that's why we're all held accountable for recognizing that God is God. And every man is without excuse. There is no excuse because God makes himself known through creation. And so this all starts at the very beginning with this idea that God is the creator of the world. It also is very important when you come to the Ten Commandments. Now, the deal is, I saw a tweet today with somebody arguing about the difference between ceremonial laws and religious laws and moral laws but the Ten Commandments, the moral laws. And if you broke down all the different rules, most of them went away. The Ten Commandments are kind of what stands because they are still moral attributes of what we should maintain, as opposed to what you should wear and what you should eat, and dietary laws and like sacrificial laws that went away with Jesus. So the whole idea of the Ten Commandments starts with what? There shall be no other God before me, right? Why? Because God is creator. Don't make any graven images. Don't make, and it goes on in other places in the Bible, why are you going to trust something that you made with your hands when God's the creator that made everything that you're making into a God? And so even the foundation of the Ten Commandments and that God is holy all comes from this idea that he is the creator of the world. The other thing is that's interesting when you think about it is if there is, and this is why God's hard to define, because in our framework mentally, if there's a beginning, there must be an end, right? And so that's why God is hard for us to comprehend because God has no beginning. So how do you have something without a beginning, right? I mean, we can say that we believe that, and we do, but how do you explain that, right? Because everything else in the world other than God has a beginning. And so that's just how our minds work. But if there is a beginning, there is an end. And so the beginning of this world ends with what? With the end times, when Jesus returns. And so really, as we look at the creation story, it's going to imply from the very beginning, in the beginning, that there's a beginning, which tells us that there's going to be an end, which we know in our Bible, you get to Revelation. So anyway, so all that helps point to why creation is so significant and why it's so important. So we're going to look at 4 different views of creation. And again, we are not looking at Big Bang Theory. We're not looking at non-biblical. All of these views are from Christians who are trying to explain what the text says and what it means and how it can coordinate. Now, some of these I think are much better than others, but they're all. So we're not talking about liberal views of stuff. I mean, we could spend more time. We're talking just strictly about people that trust God, believe in God, and so that as we look at these first 4 theories. So the first one is just original creation. That's what most of us believe. And I will say, I will sound like I'm a historical creationist because I'm going to sound like I'm a historical creationist. But when push comes to shove, I would probably lean towards the original creation theory. Probably, I'm not 100. I mean, it's still, to me, anyway, it's interesting. Original creation. Genesis 1 is normally it's considered that Genesis 1, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, is the first part of the first day, right? Because we think about that being in a moment. God creates the world in the beginning. God creates the world. And it's generally been considered that that is the first day of the Bible. And then bara is the word there. In the beginning, God created. And there is a list of terms on the back of your page. Or you'll see on the back of page 1. Or is it on page 2? Oh, it's on page 1. Oh, good. Then all you have to do is look down. I reordered them after I did it the first time. That's my confusion. Because I wanted to save the outline for last. Yeah, it's Rashid. We'll get to that one. But bara is create out of nothing, something perfect, new, first, or whole. So you see the definition there. And so that's significant because everything else, and we'll read it in just a second. I want to kind of give an overview of what we all kind of know, and then we'll go back and read the text. Or as Dr. Silheimer told us the first day I had seminary. And whether I will tell you, here's the other, what? Genesis 1:1. So most people would tell you that Genesis 1:1, that's the first part of the first day. That in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. Is okay. God created it, boom, moment of time. And now we're starting on the first day, and then we have the 6 days that follow that. So everything is created in 6 days. That's historically that's the general original creation story that most of us have heard. And a lot of us don't think about that being the first day, but if you believe in the 6-day creation, it has to be the first day. So that bara, that complete, because it comes out of nothing. We'll get there. We're starting with what we know, and then we're going to go into counter views. So in the beginning, this is why we'll learn some Hebrew. That's why we have definitions. So anyway, so in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. And then, but now the deal is, and I remember, again, so this is just so again go back to why this has always hit me so hard. It's one of the questions I had going to seminary. One of the first classes I took my first semester was, it just made sense to me that you start with the Old Testament. So I took Old Testament, and I got Dr. John Selhammer. And so this is how we start our class. Some other stuff first, but this is how, we're skipping all that. But we're going to get, when we get to the creation, he's like, what most people don't think of is when you think about the creation story, you really, when you say God created the heavens and the earth, you think about the fact that he basically just made a ball of mud. Now, I know you're thinking, I've never envisioned that in my life, right? But it really is what we kind of say happened. Because what we say is God created everything, right? So then God made the light. God made, that's a different word. That's asa. Making something implies that you take something that already exists and then form it and shape it into something. Curtis likes to work with woodwork. He makes things. You don't create. You make because you're taking the wood and you shape it and you make it into what you make it into. So that idea, everything else, till we get to man, by the way, there's 2 other places. One of them is man. God creates man. But mostly what we're going to see is the word made. So now let's go back and let's read just with that one little thing to just kind of help start thinking different about what we've read and what we've always assumed. Now let's go back and read the Bible. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was formless and empty. Darkness covered the surface of the watery depths, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the surface of the waters. Then God said, "Let there be light." There was light. God saw that the light was good, and God separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. There was an evening and there was a morning one day. Okay, this isn't in my notes, so I'm going to stop here for a second. Just to make sure I don't miss this. The word day here at the end of this verse, I didn't list this as a key word, I don't think. So the word day there, because people say, well, a day can mean a period of time. And it is true that there are places in the Bible that use the word day to mean a period of time. It's not common, but it does happen. And so people say, well, how do I know that the first day didn't last millions of years? Because to God, the days, But, well, the problem is this. It doesn't just say that God called the light day and the darkness night. there was an evening, and there was a morning, one day. So specifically in on the Bible, from the very beginning, God said there was morning and there was evening, so that there would never be 4,000 years later to be able to say, is there a question about whether a day means 1,000 years or whether a day means 24 hours? There was an evening and there was a morning, which tells me there's what? One day. So if anybody ever argues that a day can be a period, just tell them to read the whole sentence, because there was day and there was night, meaning there was what? One day, 24 hours. All right, that's not but that to me is very significant in trying to understand this. Then God said, let there be an expanse between the waters, separating from water from water. So God made the expanse and separated the water under the expanse from the water and above the expanse, and so it was. God called the expanse sky. Just for reference real quick, that word sky is the same word that's heavens in verse 1. So we'll get to that, but just want to point that out. So God called the expanse sky. Evening came, the morning. Evening came in the morning, what? The second day, right? So twice on our days, what have we said? Evening and morning. So then God said, let the water on the sky be gathered into one place. Let the dry land appear. And it was so. God called the dry land earth, and the gathering of the water he called seas. And God saw that it was good. And God let the earth produce vegetation, seed-bearing plants and fruit trees on the earth, bearing with fruit and the seed and according to their kinds. And it was so. The earth produced vegetation, seed-bearing plants according to their kinds, and trees bearing fruit with seed and according to their kinds. And God saw that it was good. Everything came, and then morning, the third day. Then God said, let there be lights in the expanse of the sky to separate the day from the night. They will serve as signs for seasons and for days and years. There will be lights in the expanse of the sky, provide light on the earth. And so it was. God made the two great lights, the greater light to rule over the day and the lesser light to rule over the night, as well as the stars. God placed them in the expanse of the sky to provide the light on the earth, to rule the day and the night, and to separate light from darkness. And God saw that it was good. Everything came the morning, the fourth day. So we always have an evening. Then God said, let the water swarm with living creatures, and let the birds fly above the earth across the expanse of the sky. So God created large sea creatures and every living creature that moves and swarms in the water according to their kinds. He also created every winged creature according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. God blessed them. Be fruitful and multiply, to fill the waters of the seas, and let the birds multiply on the earth. Evening came, and then morning, the fifth day. Then God said, and I will say, one thing to think about here is there's, as we read this, notice that we're given information that must happen over time that's set in place on the day, right? So you're be fruitful and multiply and fill the seas. All right, that's the animals are going to, just like he's going to tell Adam and Eve, they're supposed to do what? Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth, right? So they didn't immediately fill the earth with kids, right? So the same thing for the animals, it's set in place. This is what's going to happen in these places. You're going to be fruit, and the animals are going to multiply, and they're going to fill those areas. So just keep that in mind. So some of this verbiage is pointing to day, evening, sun. Other people say, look, this has to happen over time. That's why I can say that a day is 1,000 years. But that's the difference. It's where things are going to happen. Also, there are things that this is definitive, day, evening. Very specific that it is day and evening.
The trees and vegetation.
So, that's a good question. So, I would answer yes. In the same way that God did not create, and this is the way in a seven-day creation theory, I think you easily can explain like how stuff looks like it's been around for thousands of years, or millions of years, or whatever, part of the way. One is the flood, but two is also God made things mid-age. He didn't make Adam as an infant, right? So when God created Adam, he wasn't an infant. So it would be silly, I think, to think that when God created a tree, that he made it a sapling and it had to grow, right? So you're creating trees, you're creating birds that are able to fly because they're not going to have a mom to feed. I mean, so yes, again, it's pointing to what they're going to do over time. But yes, they're immediately created at adulthood. And same thing for trees, with the level of maturity, same thing for a tree, same thing for birds, same thing for whatever. Snakes for Barbara. And by the way, not that my grandkids can be trolls. Tristan last week had a shirt with a snake on it and had to call Nani so that Nani could see the shirt with the snake and he could go, "Hiss." I told Madeline, I don't know how you raise 3 kids. They're all 3 bad. They're just all trolls. It's fascinating. It's just inherent in that family. Yeah. If God's put the sun and the moon, there is nothing anywhere ever to indicate in anybody at any time that it is other than a 24-hour period. There's no evidence from, even in the Big Bang Theory, they don't argue different than that. There's no concept by the Hebrews when they read this who it was intended to. Remember, we're reading this to the Hebrews. No Hebrew that Moses was writing to they could have confused day as being a period of time. They would not confuse morning and evening as a day. Day is defined morning and evening. And so the day, so it's a 24-hour period is what they're talking about. I mean, that's it's written in there to confirm this is a 24-hour period and not a period of time.
So, what comes first, the chicken or the egg?
Well, I would say the chicken had to come first because you had to be an adult first. Adam came before the babies and Eve. Okay. Then God said, let the water swarm to eat living creatures and let the birds fly above the earth across the expanse of the sea. So God created the large sea creatures and every living creature that moves and swarms in the water according to their kinds. He also created every winged creature according to its kind, and God saw that it was good. God blessed them. Be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth. I already read that. Even the 5th day. Okay, now you turn. Then God said, let the earth produce living creatures according to their kinds, livestock, creatures that crawl, and the wildlife of the earth according to their kinds. And it was so. So God made the wildlife on the earth according to their kinds, the livestock according to their kinds, and the creatures that crawl on the ground according to their kinds. And God saw it was good. And God said, let us make in our image according to our likeness. They will rule the fish of the sea, the birds of the sky, the livestock on the whole earth, and the creatures that crawl on the earth. So God created man in his own image. He created him in the image of God. He created them male and female. Can I just tell you, by the way, in all the garbage going on today about male and female, that God had the foreknowledge and wisdom to put that in the first chapter of Genesis, absolutely, I mean, seriously, that should speak to the intelligence of God when he wrote the Bible, to know that one day we're so decadent that would be an issue. God created male and female. And by the way, I also think it's significant that it is important that we understand the roles of males and females. We get that in chapter 2. When God talks about creation, men and women are equal. Does not mean they are equal physically, emotionally, or created exactly the same. They are created, as it explains in chapter 2, to be together and to make each other whole. But they are absolutely of equal value. And God, knowing that controversy was coming, made sure that the first time we bring up men and women in the Bible, that they are absolutely equal. And it just fascinates me with the stuff we've had in the last 50 years that comes up. It's in Genesis 1. You ain't got to go to Genesis 2. You got it in Genesis 1. All right. God bless them. What's that?
It speaks of his intelligence and ours.
In our lack of, yes. God bless them. Okay. I'm telling you, I could take a year and get through the first 11 chapters because everything is so foundational that's built, because even like what Hal just said, this whole idea that God had to explain to us so that we would understand it. Isn't it interesting that John starts with what? In the beginning was the Word. Because we have to understand what God revealed to us in the Bible. In the beginning of that revelation is creation. It's just the way that whole thing fits together is just absolutely incredible. I get excited about the whole Bible whenever I go back to the first of Genesis. God blessed them. God said to them, be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth, and subdue it. rule the fish over the sea, the birds of the sky, and every creature that crawls on the earth. God also asked, look, I have given you every seed-bearing plant on the surface of the entire earth and every tree whose fruit contains seed. This will be food for you. For all the wildfire of the earth, for every bird of the sky, every creature that crawls on the earth, everything having the breath of life in it. I have given every green plant for food. And it was so. God saw all that he had made, and it was very good indeed. Evening came, and then morning, the sixth day. So the heavens and the earth and everything in them were completed. The seventh day, God had completed his work that had been done, and he rested on the seventh day from all his work that he had done. God blessed the seventh day and declared it holy, for on it he rested from all the work of his creation. It is interesting, by the way. Does anybody think God needed a rest after 6 days? No, right? He just rested to set an example for us. We'll get to that more next week. But anyway, so. Sure.
I give every green plant
Yes.
poison ivy.
So, the question is, did poison ivy exist before the fall? Or was it poisonous before the fall? Or is that a consequence of the fall? I would argue that you could eat poison ivy and you could do anything you wanted to before the fall, because there was no death and there was no illness. And so so you're pre-fall. So
They're going to be fruitful and multiply. You're going to have a lot of animals running around. There's nobody using them.
yeah. Well, and ultimately, so what? Well, let me just clarify. So what?
Man was not listening to me at the very beginning.
Many people, the people argue that that he wasn't eating meat. There's actually, certainly, if there was the first 2 deer, they didn't eat the first 2 deer. But as they populated, there's actually nothing that says that man couldn't eat deer, and they did offer sacrifices.
That's what I mean.
So-
I've been confused about that you had the 2 sons were raising, one was raising grain, one was raising animals.
Mhm.
And we had to fall at that particular time.
Yes.
We
Yeah,
had.
it was just Adam and Eve when the fall happened.
Okay, so up to that, up to the time, they hadn't had any kids. So the fall happened, and then you had separation, where God said, you will be able to eat any meat, any animal with total feet. Is that right?
Oh, that comes in Exodus.
Okay, that Exodus.
Yeah, that's part of the commands in Exodus and Deuteronomy. So that's part of the law that comes at Mount Sinai.
Okay.
So that's when God gives dietary restrictions. There are no biblically stated dietary restrictions, I don't believe, until you get to the dietary laws in Exodus. So a lot of people argue that you couldn't eat meat, but there is nothing declarative about that. It's like people say that it didn't rain until the flood. And there's really no indication that there wasn't rain before the flood. It just didn't rain like that. It just didn't rain like that when it rained. So a lot of people say that's the first rain. So there's a lot of things that we hear that are built on arguments of silence and assumption within the text. And that's why, as we go back and look at some of the key words in the text, we want to go back and really look at what the text says and try to remove our assumptions that we have, that we just, and that's hard to remove some, because their assumptions are ingrained in us and things we've always heard. And so we want to make sure that we have an open mind we want to have a discerning open mind. It's about the best way I can say it. You want to listen to something to see if it's reasonable, understanding it may not be, but at least give it a fair chance to analyze it. But there is no specific restriction that they couldn't eat meat. A lot of people say they couldn't eat meat until after the fall because then you were allowed to kill animals. It doesn't say that. They were able to rule over the animals. So whether you could, maybe they didn't. I don't know. Maybe they did just live by a vegetarian diet, because a lot of people tell you even now scientifically, best diet you can eat is a vegetarian diet. Although some guy from another country was in our country visiting, they asked him what he liked most about America, and he said hamburgers. That fascinated me that was his answer. Yeah.
What's the timeline from creation fall?
No idea. That's chapter 3, but the short answer is we don't know. It just doesn't tell us. I would hope it was at least, I'd like to think they had 2 or 3 good years in there. You know, I like hoping it's not like day 9 where they sinned right away, although we don't know. So, yeah.
I have a question. On the days like when you read the different animals, so how do you picture it? Is it like, I haven't really thought about it, is it like, back when they used to show Bewitched or something and they go, you know, and just,
I don't know. That's what you know, because it's interesting. And so to me, I would argue ex nihilo God created heavens and the earth. So let's go back to the mud ball theory that I know y'all thought was crazy, right? So because I'd never thought about it that way, but it really makes a lot of sense. If I create everything, and I got this mud ball here, now all of a sudden I'm going to pull out the day, and I'm going to pull out the sun, I'm going to pull out the moon, I'm going to pull out the light, I'm going to pull out the dark, I'm going to pull out the animals. And I'm going to, you know, and so all of a sudden I'm forming all these things from what's already been made. That would imply, like he made man out of dust, that God took something and made it, didn't create it. The idea, if he just said, okay, I'm going to create a bird out of nothing, would be the bewitched theory, bing, and it just happens.
so it wasn't just one kind of bird, there were many different.
But he made them all out of, but he could have made them out. But, well, yeah. So yeah, it's just hard to say. And when you talk about the different kind of birds, are there really like about 10 type of birds, and then over time they've met like dogs, right? So if you take the tree of what a dog is, I mean, you got dogs, you got wolves, you got how many different dogs, you know, that have bred differently over the course of time. Difference between microevolution and macroevolution. You stay within the same species. So did you have as many birds then as you have now? So there's a lot of interesting sides to that are, and to be honest, the Bible doesn't say.
Also, it doesn't say that he made the light.
No, it says it wasn't say form the light.
It said, let there be light.
In verse 3.
Yeah.
And then, and it's always been confusing to me, what was that light? And then later in 14, we have.
He made the sun and the moon. Yeah.
So what was the original light?
Okay, we'll get there. Well, this is why I say you really, these are all good questions, because I think these are, and the thing is, everything that y'all have asked so far, and the reasons they're good questions, is somebody that doesn't believe the Bible will ask you those same. None of y'all are asking if the cynical view of the Bible is not true. But almost every question you ask can be asked from a cynical, well, how was their light if there wasn't the sun and the moon till 3 days later? You know, so I would point you toward, well, not yet. All right. We'll get to it. We'll get there. We'll be there. Like I said, we will be here at least 1 or 2 weeks.
One more question before you move on. And
We-
you're not going to tell me at some point if it's referenced.
And we've only done the first part of the notes so far, so it's not even like we're even close to jumping in deep. Go ahead. Sorry. Well,
Okay, so this is Moses writing to the Israelites.
Yeah.
God would have told them, but to me, it's storyline. So of course, the Israelites only know evening, morning, day, 24-hour period of time. So is somewhere in some of that, that was just how it was explained to them.
yeah. I mean, again, that's what I was saying about the day thing before. I think that's why you put the evening. Again, the word day can be interpreted period of time, and by tagging it evening every time, you know, this is so when we see this, when we get to the 6 days of everything being formed and shaped and created, are made, then when we get to that period of time. Sorry, I lost my train of thought for a second. I went back to my mud ball, and you pull the light out of the mud. That's how that happens. But when it says that he said, "Let there be light," it comes out of the mud. Is kind of the theory behind that. So going back to what Marsha was saying, what was your question again? I just completely lost track.
It was more just an observation. Moses is writing to the Israelites,
Okay.
and I can understand why he would explain something in terms of what
Yep.
they would understand and grasp.
Yes.
Evening and morning, day one.
Yep.
You know.
Yeah. But in doing that, it also sets up for arguments thousands of years later as well. So it's just kind of,
But how do you come to the conclusion that he pulled it out of the mud versus he just created like this? He created,
because it didn't say he created light, it said he created the heavens and the earth.
it didn't say he pulled it out of the mud.
But, okay, let's go down, it's all right. Let's go down to, let's see if I've got the key word there. The heavens and the earth, number 4. All right, so let's go to heavens and the earth. So we'll go ahead and just deal with this one right at the start. Yep. All right, the heavens and the earth. Most of the time, majority of the time, in the Bible, and I haven't got all the verses there, I've got some, but not all of them, and we'll hit this some more as we go through historical creationism. But the idea of heavens and the earth, that they chose to use the word heavens and chose to use the word earth. Our first English Bibles were written heading into the Enlightenment, and also as they were greatly influenced. Even the Greek Septuagint was greatly influenced by Greek philosophy. And so the Greek philosophy of there's heavens and there's earth and there's these other realms and all the different arguments that they, the Stoics and all the different philosophies that were happening about how creation began. The idea that even the words heaven and earth can go back to being saying that those were biasly chosen based on a worldview instead of saying land and sky, because the simple definition of those words is land and sky. So, in the majority of the time that they are used, there are times that the word that's translated earth is used to mean the whole earth. There's a couple verses that support that, and you can look at that. But the majority of the time, it means land. And so it's the land. You're going to grow the land. They're going to come out of the land. Even in the creation account, they grow out of the land. So it's land and not earth. And so really the view that the Hebrews would have had is basically the world's in 3 parts. Now so heaven. If I say heaven, if I say somebody's in heaven, are you going to point up or down? Up, right? You know where Hebrew would point? Down. Because they believe the Hebrew heaven is called Sheol. And Sheol is separated, and we say Sheol can be used to mean Gehenna, but Sheol is divided into paradise, or Abraham's bosom. Today, by the way, Jesus said, today you'll be in paradise. He's not talking about heaven, he's talking about paradise. The way the Jews would have understood it at the time he said that on the cross, you're in paradise, which is in the earth. You're buried in the earth, you're in the earth. It's Sheol, and it's so Sheol is divided to paradise, Abraham's bosom, and Gehenna. And so anybody that died, that's the holding place until the Messiah comes. And the Messiah is the first one, the first fruit of heaven. All right? So when you say heavens and earth, we think heaven's God's realm and earth where we live, right? Is that not how we generally think of heavens and earth, right? That's not how the Hebrews would have seen it. They would have seen sky and land, because heavens would have been, if you think about heavens where people are as well, now you think God's out in the sky, in the heavens, but you're not going to think that's where a person would go. And so when you're writing and talking about a sky, so basically when you look at the world that God created, and if you go back and read the passage we just read, there's the sky, there's land, and there's the water. All right, so there's sky, there's land, and there's water. And that's kind of how they would view so when they're reading this account, what they're picturing is God made the sky and everything. It's what's called a merism. If I say that Jesus is the Alpha and the Omega, what does that mean? Right? He's the beginning and the end, he's everything, right? That's a merism, because Alpha and Omega, I'm not saying alpha, beta, gamma, delta, epsilon, and doing the whole alphabet. I'm just saying Alpha and Omega. So when I say Alpha and Omega, first and the last, you know that that's an entire, it means the entirety, right? So this is a merism. Sky and land, that's the 2 major parts of the creation. Sky and land, there's the water stuff too, but sky and land. So basically the expression sky and land is a merism to say God created. If you can see it, God created. And so anything that's created, instead of thinking about it, it's like heaven and earth are separated in that sense. It's basically and that's going to be when we get to the gap theory. That's basically the gap theory says and God created everything. Then there's a gap between verse 1 and 2. And that's when you get to the 6 days creation. The gap theory, by the way, was developed by the idea of trying to deal with science, because people started to get scared of science and say, well, if all these things are thousands of millions of years old, then how are we going to deal with that? And one way we deal with that is we say, okay, creation, then 1,000,000 years can happen, and then God can do what we see in verse 2. Again, idea Selhammer kind of calls it the mud theory. And then all of a sudden now he's going to shape everything. Because we get to the second verse, everything's shapeless and void. That's also where that kind of comes from, is that everything is shapeless and void. Now it has to be shaped into. You've got to see the light, pull it out of the darkness, and separate. So in your formless and void, you're going to pull out the light and the darkness. And so everything comes, but everything's been made, heaven and earth, sky and land, that you can see, and it's a merism. So that's really the best way to think of that first verse, because it's the totality of everything is created by God. There is not one thing that's not created, which, by the way, sounds like John chapter 1. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, and the Word was God, and everything was created by the Word, right? I mean, in totality. And so they use a merism to do that in Genesis 1 to do that. All right. Does that answer your question, sort of? Created everything and then formed things later. Because we got verse 2 is formless and void, so we got to do a formless and void.
So it's like in your mud ball is what he created.
Right. So in verse 2, now the earth was formless and empty. So if you look at your terms number 6, tohu wabohu. Tohu is trackless, physical emptiness, chaos, and you will see as creation comes on that really the first 3 days of creation deal with tohu, the formless part, or shapeless part. Then wabuhu, empty. Then on days 4 through 6 is when God puts stuff in the earth, or in the creation, and that's that's when you feel what was empty. So the two key words there to understand is that it's so basically God created everything, the sky and the sea, so he creates it, and now it's formless and empty, and again, Dr. Selhammer called it, so it's formless and empty, it's just there. And then from that shapeless, formless void, that's where, and God's Spirit hovers over the surface of the waters that are there, and then said, let there be light, and then all of a sudden now, okay, we're going to start pulling stuff out of and shaping it. We're now showing there's going to be a difference between light and dark. And then day and night, and we go on from there. So nobody, by the way, believes in the mud theory. It's just one way to try to explain the difference between created and making, because the focus is there's something formless and empty. So if I'm saying that God in these 6 days is doing these things to everything for the first time, then I have to start with there's nothing but a creation something, and then God's going to pull everything. He's going to pull light out, dark out, water hovers over it, and all that. So you've got to deal with the formless and void, not just that he created everything. The gap theory, again, says that there's a gap there, that it could have been a long period of time between when God began to do that. People would argue that Satan fell. Part of gap theory is that Satan fell between verses 1 and 2. So God creates everything, and some people say, and I've never found the verses, and the verses people have given me, this is one of those things I wrestle with in creation, is they say that like Satan existed and the angels existed, and then God. I remember in the little children's story Bible we had when I was growing up. So I'm asking this question in my head as a 5 and 6 and 7 year old, whatever age we went through the children's story Bible. Because to me, if you make everything, heavens and earth, sky and land and sky, if you've made everything, that would include Satan. So I don't understand why we say Satan was created before then and angels were created before then, because if I create everything in verse 1, then I create Satan in there. So gap theory takes that theory, that Satan's created in verse 1, and that his fall is in somewhere between verse 1 and 2. If you go to Jeremiah and Isaiah, that's the passages about Satan's fall from heaven, and so by the gap theory. And so verse 2 just describes the state of the universe, creates out of nothing, but the state of the universe is that nothingness and that wasteland. And so it was a bit chaotic state, and then it was pulled out of the chaotic state. Now, the number one, the biggest, how many of y'all have heard of the Schofield Reference Bible? Okay, I would argue that the Schofield Reference Bible is probably the most influential Bible of all time, of study Bibles. In fact, I don't even think there's a close second. I mean, it is Schofield Bible, and there's everybody else, because there's two major theories that came out of the Schofield Bible. That gap theory was accepted for a while and then was eventually rejected, and most haven't even heard of it, or a lot haven't heard of it. But the other part of that is the Schofield Bible is the Bible where the idea of the rapture came from. The interpretation that says there's going to be a rapture, and then so the Schofield Bible is the one that really shaped and made that the most common evangelical belief, that there is an idea of a rapture. And so that, again, if you go back to John Calvin, if you go back to Martin Luther, if you go back to anybody prior to 1830, there was really not the idea of a rapture. It wasn't perceived that way. It was like that all happens. There was one second coming to Jesus. And I'm not saying it's wrong. I'm just saying the Schofield Bible is the same Bible that made the gap theory, the idea of a gap theory, and the idea of the rapture both came from the Schofield Bible. It is and that is the dominant evangelical thought today, is the thought put into the interpretation made by the Schofield Reference Bible. And it was not a popular belief until the Schofield Reference Bible. But it also, the Schofield Reference Bible is what explains the gap theory. Okay, we're going to stop there. And we'll hit relative beginning, and then we'll finally get to historical creationism, which is the longest part of the creation story. No, not really, but it's, anyway, we'll explain that. But I thought I saw Bob last week after it was over, or the week before last, maybe. Was I here last week? I forget. So last week or 2 weeks ago? Yes, 2 weeks ago. I was here last week. Yeah, we after Joshua. I made the comment to Bob afterwards. I said, one of the things I do want to do is stop and answer questions, because I would rather take time with the questions that y'all are asking, because that's the easiest place for somebody to learn. And so a lot of stuff that you're going to ask me, I would get to eventually, but you just don't know the order. I mean, that's the whole, like I said, I shifted my order. I had everything printed out and reshuffled it when I went back and started looking at it again. So I also, by the way, was going to have blanks for all the definitions, and there were fill in the blanks all over this sheet. And I decided this afternoon that I would not do that to y'all, because I want you to be able to listen and not have to write down, except for at the beginning. I didn't have much detail you wanted on that, so I gave you blanks for those first four. But that's probably about the only place I'll leave blanks, because I would rather you listen instead of, because if you, my thing is, I'll write something quick when I'm like listening to a sermon, because I want to have an outline. Like last week when we went to the Presbyterian church, I had an outline, and I want to write the outline, because it helps me stay engaged to listen for the outline points. That's why. So for me, that just helps to write something. But I don't have to write down long stuff. That's why when I preach, I like using fill in the blanks. So just like one or two words to make sure you're paying attention. It helps you stay engaged, but not enough to where you have to think. Because if you have to think to write all of it down, then you're not listening to me, and that defeats the purpose of me trying to explain what you're writing down. So that's why I gave you the definitions written out. So you're welcome. Because I thought about that, I was like, that's going to take too much time to restate it. When you think of the creation story the way you've always heard it, that's it. That's the original creation. That's just the original creation story, the way all of us would believe creation happened growing up.
It didn't say.
The argument, I would say, yeah. I would say both of those are timeless. Now here's where I get in trouble on the timeless thing. I am not a subscriber to God exists and is not bound by time. Okay, so let me make that clear. God is not bound by time. I do not subscribe to the theory that some people use in describing timelessness, that it's like watching a parade, where I watch the parade and I see the band come through and everything comes through, and then I see Santa Claus, right? All right, we're doing Christmas parades. So Santa Claus, because Santa Claus always lasts, right? That's the one parade you know which lasts. So Santa Claus. So what a lot of people say outside of time is that I stand there on the street, I watch everything pass in front of me because I'm in time. God stands above all of it, and he sees everything at the same time. And so therefore, God's not bound by time and God's not in time. And I don't think that's true. I think God is actively involved in time, or else God wouldn't be answering prayers. I think it's very inconsistent to say God can answer prayer if he already, that if the beginning and end already exist and God is outside of that. How can God interact in time? So I think God's outside of time as far as not being bound by time. I do not subscribe to the parade theory. Now, if you don't understand the parade theory, that's fine. That's just one of the ways people explain it. But I think God has to act. My big thing is God acts in time. Because if God doesn't act in time, he doesn't answer prayer. And the Bible tells me that God answers prayer. And so,
He didn't act in time. How would he have Christ come to earth?
because he sees it's already happened, and that's why it's a weird. That's the parade theory. In God's eyes, it's already happened at one because it's outside of time. So to God, it all happens at the exact same time. I don't like the theory. I'm just telling you what people say. I don't think it makes sense. I don't subscribe to it at all. I think it's a bunch of hooey. But that's how some people explain it. So to say that he's outside of time, yes, he's not bound by time. But to say he exists outside time in that way, I don't agree with. So it depends how you ask, what does timeless mean? What was the other one? Space? Same thing. Like our universe is still expanding beyond what we know of as space. So yes, I think God's outside of space and we're just... Okay, just to share TMI. I can remember sitting as y'all just know I'm weird. Okay, I acknowledge my weirdness, and I'd sit in the tub, and sometimes y'all probably never had tubs that dripped, but our tub on occasion would drip, and you had to turn it exactly right. Anyway, and sometimes one side, sometimes anyway. So the drip. So when the drip would come down, so in my mind, I'm sitting there thinking, I wonder, could God create a world that started in that drip of water and went through all the time and then dropped down and then... So just trying to think about God in space and time. Could you have something that God created in that small drop and like Horton Hears a Who, right? Really big, and there's little tiny things you don't know what's going on. Does God have another universe? I don't know. This is what we know. And so I do not think God's limited by space in any capacity. I don't think you can put any limits on God of any kind. The idea, can God make because the philosophers like to say, can God make a rock big enough he can't move? So you're either limiting that you can't make a rock that big, or you're limiting by there's something he can't move, and it's just a stupid argument because God exists outside of a sphere that matters. That's a man question. That's not a God question. So I think he exists outside of time and space, but not in the way a lot of people do. So anyway.
You'd probably say that they were created. They were not something.
Yes, I would say that's part of his creation. I think part of creation, because I think when you go to where it's just the Trinity, Father, Son, Holy Spirit, there's no angels. Even if angels were created before in the beginning, they were still created. I mean, in my mind, it makes more sense to think they were created in the beginning with everything else. But whenever angels were created, before any of that ever happened, before that, it was Father, Son, Holy Spirit. And they didn't have time, and they didn't have space. They just are. That's why God's name is I am. I mean, it just, I am, which can be interpreted, I exist. God just exists. And that, again, for us, we have to have beginning and ends because that's how our brain works. But God just is. And so God is. Outside of time, outside of space, he just is. And Jesus gave all that up to come in the form of me. Yeah, it's just phenomenal. That to me, I don't think we pay that anyway. That's why I quote Philippians 2 a lot. Just the idea that God, I mean, just think about that. It's the Trinity. It's the only thing that exists. And then in creation, you got the angels, and they worship you all day. The angels worship you, and you say, "I'm going to give that up and go die on a cross." And he who knew no sin became sin. It's just incomprehensible. And that's where my brain goes every time I go to Genesis 1. when you start to think about the enormity of a God that created the world beyond time, space, whatever. And he decided that he loves us so much that he would come in the form of a babe in a manger, walk a perfect life where he was hated for doing nothing but good, and take on sin and be separated from the Father that in eternity past that we can't even imagine has never been separated. In that moment in time, Jesus was separated from the Father. My God, why hast thou forsaken me? That God loves us that much, I think is incomprehensible. And and to me, so when you go to creation, just that, all of that stuff comes back to me every time I go through creation. That's why I love Genesis 1. And that's why I love the first of Genesis, the creation, because it all is knowing the enormity. You know, in my Bible, and this is a study Bible, so you don't get a lot of extra pages. That's creation. That's not even this. That's the creation story. And we got that much more to go. But none of this happens. It's not based on everything that we read there. And that's why this gets me, because that none of this exists without that. It's just phenomenal. Sorry. Love Genesis. I ran over. My guess is it will not be the last time in Genesis we run long, just because I tried to wrap up 5 minutes early. Well, that's right. So that's okay. All right, let's pray. Dear God, we praise you as God because you are God. And Lord, hard for us to wrap our brains around, hard for us to know exactly what that means even, but we know it's true. And so we believe that by faith, because we see your work, we see your creation, we see your invisible attributes in creation. We read your word that is true and tells us the story of Jesus, and that he did give up the glories of heaven to die on a cross, was obedient to the point of death, not just any death, but the death of the cross. We praise his name for it, name above all others. We thank you for that. We praise you for that. We worship you for that. Help us, God, to have an enthusiasm and a passion and a love for the world you created, the life you give us, the salvation you give us, and the opportunity you give us to share with others how much we love you, which will never compare to how much you love us. It's in the name of Jesus Christ we pray. Amen.